They say the Appalachians hide things older than the mountains themselves, things that don't breathe the way we do. So, when the locals first smelled that sweet, sickening odor drifting out of Blackbriar Swamp, they didn't go looking for its source. Not at first, but then someone saw him. A small, barefoot boy standing knee-deep in the water, staring back with eyes too dull for a child, and skin that looked wrong, like it had been soaking in something foul for far too long. They thought he needed help, until he stepped onto the bank and pieces of dark, waterlogged flesh slid from his arm like wet bark peeling off a dead tree. The boy didn't scream. He didn't even blink. He just whispered, almost politely, "I'm not supposed to be out here yet." That's when they realized the smell wasn't coming from the swamp. It was coming from him. The people living near Blackbriar Swamp never agreed on what truly happened the night the boy came into this world, but every version of the story shared one detail. He wasn't T-born the way normal children are. The storm that tore across the Appalachians that night was the kind that made even seasoned hunters stay locked inside their cabins. Lightning split trees in half, thunder shook the valley floor, and the swamp churned like something alive beneath its surface. In the middle of that chaos, a scream echoed through the rain, except it didn't sound like a mother in labor. It sounded like the swamp itself was calling out. A group of locals claimed they saw a shadowed figure stumbling through the mud, clutching her stomach as if something inside her was clawing its way out, but before she could reach shelter, she collapsed at the water's edge. When the storm calmed just enough for them to rush to her, they found something so strange that most of them spent the rest of their lives trying to forget it. The woman was barely conscious, covered in mud, leaves, and dark, foul-smelling water, but beside her, half submerged in the swamp, was a newborn boy. Not wrapped in cloth, not held in his mother's arms, but lying directly in the black water like he'd been placed there on purpose. Some swore they saw the water ripple toward him rather than away, as if the swamp accepted him instead of rejecting him. One old man, who would never speak of the incident again after that night, whispered that the baby wasn't delivered, he was offered. His skin had a grayish tint, slick with a sheen that didn't look like normal birth fluids. It looked thicker, darker, almost like the mud itself was coating him. And even more unsettling was the faint odor coming off him. Something too sweet, too heavy, like the beginning stages of decay. Newborns weren't supposed to smell like that. Newborns weren't supposed to look like they'd already spent hours soaking in stagnant water. The woman tried to lift her head and reach for her child, but she didn't have the strength. She managed to whisper only one sentence before passing out completely, and the men who heard her never forgot it, because her eyes weren't looking at them, they were staring at the swamp behind them, wide with fear as she breathed out the words. It wanted him back. Even though the storm eventually passed, the memory of that night never did. The rumor spread that the boy wasn't born from her, but from whatever lay beneath the swampy surface. Something ancient, something patient, something that chose him. And while the locals wanted to deny what they'd seen, they couldn't. Shake the feeling that the swamp hadn't just been a place where the boy appeared. It was his first cradle, his first breath, his first home, and maybe even the force that had created him in the first place. From the moment the boy learned to walk, people noticed that something about his body wasn't right. But at first they blamed the swamp water, the humidity, anything that made sense. Children fall, scrape their knees, bruise their skin, that's normal. But with him, every mark, every tiny bump or scratch turned into something darker. A bruise on his arm didn't fade in a few days. It deepened, blackening like old fruit left too long in the sun. A small cut didn't scab over. Instead, the skin around it softened and peeled as if it belonged to something no longer living. His mother tried covering the spots with cloth, oils, even old folk remedies passed down by mountain midwives, but nothing stopped the slow, creeping rot that spread over him. It moved unpredictably. One day his shoulder would look gray and waterlogged. The next day his ribs would show through skin that seemed thinner than paper. Yet the boy never ran a fever, never cried from pain, never flinched the way normal children do. He simply watched the changes in quiet confusion as though he'd expected it his entire life. Doctors from nearby towns examined him and walked away more puzzled than when they arrived. One physician insisted it had to be a rare infection, but the boy's blood showed nothing. Another claimed it was a genetic disorder, something unrecorded, but the way the decay shifted across his body made no scientific sense. It was as if the rot had a mind of its own, choosing where to settle each week. They took photographs, samples, even sent reports to specialists in bigger cities, but within days the experts wrote back that the skin samples didn't behave like tissue from a living child. They degraded too fast, as if they were already dead when removed. One doctor refused to come back after a second visit because, according to him, the boy's skin felt unnaturally cold. Not like chilled flesh, but like touching something that had been submerged in deep water for hours. By the time the boy was 5, his condition became impossible to hide. Children avoided him on sight, not because he looked frightening, but because animals reacted so violently around him. Dogs that had been friendly their whole lives suddenly growled and backed away when he approached. Horses refused to let him ride. Even birds stopped singing when he walked under trees, leaving only a heavy silence trailing behind him. His mother tried telling him he was just different, that it wasn't his fault, but even she sometimes had to step outside to breathe when the scent around him thickened. It wasn't always strong. Some days it was barely noticeable, but on others, the sweetness of decay clung to him so tightly it filled the house. Despite everything, the boy didn't grow weak. His body rotted, but he didn't. He played, walked, ate, slept like any other child, unfazed by what was happening to his flesh. And that frightened the adults more than anything. Flesh that decayed should cause agony. Bones that shifted under thinning skin should bring screams, but he never complained. Not once. It was as if the rot wasn't hurting him, but becoming him. Animals sensed the truth about the boy long before the adults dared to consider it. Long before the missing hunter, long before the strange trails in the mud, the creatures of the Appalachians were the first to understand that something was deeply wrong with him. It started with small things: cats that used to sleep on porches suddenly arching their backs when he passed, hissing with fur standing straight up as if confronted by a predator. Dogs that had known him since before he could speak began whining whenever he came near, pulling back on their leashes, refusing to let him touch them even though he reached out with the gentle curiosity of a child. At first people blamed it on his scent. Children get into mud, swamps, water, they smell strange. But this reaction wasn't normal, and it wasn't occasional. It was immediate, instinctive, and universal, the kind of primal response animals have when something triggers the oldest fear written into their bones. As the boy grew older, the reactions intensified. Stray dogs gathered outside his home but didn't bark or approach. They simply stood watching him from a distance, hackles raised, as if waiting for him to make a move they already understood to be dangerous. The woods around his house, normally full of chirping, croaking, rustling life, became eerily silent when he stepped onto the path. The frogs stopped calling, the insects quieted. Even the owls ceased their nightly hoots, leaving a blanket of stillness that followed him like a shadow. Animals weren't just avoiding him, they were tracking him, circling him, studying him with wide, unblinking fear. But the strangest behavior came from the creatures of the swamp itself. Snapping turtles surfaced whenever he approached the water's edge, their beady eyes fixed on him as if recognizing something familiar. Dark eels and water snakes writhed up from the depths, slithering around his feet without biting, moving the way they would around something that belonged to their world. His mother once found him standing knee-deep in the murky water with dozens of swamp insects clinging to his legs like they were trying to crawl closer to the source of something they sensed inside him. When she screamed and yanked him out, the insects didn't scatter, they stayed clustered on the water's surface, circling as though waiting for him to return. The boy didn't understand any of this. He loved animals, tried to feed the strays, reached down to pet frogs and turtles, wanting desperately to feel normal. But every time he extended his hand, the animals reacted like they were being confronted by something between life and death, something their instincts told them had no place walking above the waterline. The adults whispered that animals had sharper senses than people, that they could smell storms before they came, danger before it showed itself. If that was true, then the boy's worsening condition wasn't the part that frightened the animals. It was what was growing inside him, something ancient and swamp-born that every creature recognized long before any human dared to look closely enough to see it too. The disappearance of the hunter was the moment the townspeople realized the boy's condition wasn't just a strange medical mystery or some unfortunate curse of nature. It was the moment fear became real, tangible, something that wrapped icy fingers around the entire community and squeezed. The hunter, an experienced man named Earl Merritt, had lived near the swamp his entire life. He knew every tree root, every sinkhole, every patch of ground soft enough to swallow a boot hole. If anyone could navigate those waters blindfolded, it was Earl, so when he didn't return home one cold autumn evening, no one's first instinct was worry. They assumed he'd set up camp or gotten caught in the fog. But by the next morning, when his wife found his bed untouched and his rifle missing, the whispers began. A search party was formed quickly. Men with lanterns, dogs trained to track scents, even a few brave teenagers joined the effort. They combed through the woods, calling his name, sweeping their lights through the reeds and vines that twisted together like skeletal fingers. Normally the dogs would have been the heroes of the search, but this time, as soon as they neared the swamp, they froze. Their noses twitched, their tails tucked, and every single one began to whine with a fear none of the handlers had ever heard before. They wouldn't take another step forward. Some even tried to run back toward town. The men cursed, yanked their leashes, tried to encourage them, but it was useless. The dogs were terrified, and when animals refused to follow their instincts, humans should listen. Still, the men pushed deeper into the swamp on foot. Hours passed with no sign of Earl, not a footprint, not a broken branch, nothing. It was as if he had evaporated into the fog. Then just before dusk, one of the men, an older trapper with trembling hands, called out that he'd found something. The others rushed over and saw Earl's jacket hanging from a twisted cypress root, almost like it had been placed there deliberately. It wasn't torn or snagged. It was draped neatly, the sleeves dangling just above the black water. The men lifted it, expecting to find blood, mud, or bullet holes, but instead they were met with a smell that made their stomachs tighten. A familiar smell, sweet, heavy rot. The same scent that clung to the boy whenever his skin peeled and darkened. The scent the townspeople had tried so hard to ignore. The men looked around the swamp, their faces pale, their breaths shaking in the cooling air. There was no trail, no struggle, no footprints leading away. Only the jacket and that suffocating smell. The trapper dropped it immediately and whispered that it wasn't swamp rot they were smelling, it was the boy's rot. And that realization spread like wildfire through the group. If Earl had fallen into the water, his jacket wouldn't have been dry enough to smell like that. If he had been attacked by an animal, there would have been signs. But there was nothing except the decay that everyone in town had come to associate with the child they feared, but couldn't to bring themselves to blame. By nightfall, the search had collapsed. Men hurried home, refusing to look back at the swamp as fog curled around its edges like something alive. No one said it out loud, but every one of them carried the same thought in their minds. Earl Merritt hadn't gone missing. He had been taken. And whatever had taken him was somehow connected to the boy whose body had been rotting slowly, steadily, unnaturally since the day he came into the world. The boy's confession came on a night when the air felt too still, too heavy, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. His mother had grown used to his quiet nature, but lately even she sensed something shifting inside him, something that had nothing to do with the peeling skin or the sickly sweet odor that clung to him like a second layer. He had begun waking in the middle of the night, sitting upright in bed with his eyes unfocused, listening to something only he could hear. At first she thought it was nightmares, but he wasn't frightened when she touched his shoulder. He seemed almost attentive, like he was listening to a voice coming from far away. She asked him what he heard, but he always shook his head, insisting he didn't remember. Then one evening, while she was preparing supper, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said her name in a voice too calm for a child. She turned, expecting to see him with another bruise or another patch of gray skin spreading somewhere new, but instead she found him trembling slightly, not from pain but from something deeper. He said he needed to tell her something he had been trying to ignore. She knelt down to meet his eyes, already bracing herself for whatever truth was weighing on him. He told her that sometimes, especially at night, he could feel the swamp beneath the house, not just hear it, not just smell it, feel it. He said the water moved inside his chest the way it did when wind rippled across the surface. He said he heard low, gurgling breaths, slow and heavy, like something enormous sleeping beneath the muddy floorboards. He said it called to him in a language he didn't understand but somehow recognized. His mother tried to reassure him, telling him it was just his imagination, that swamps didn't breathe, and nothing beneath the ground was calling his name. But the boy shook his head and stepped closer, his voice dropping into a whisper. He said the swamp wasn't calling his name, it was calling for something inside him, something he didn't know he had. He told her it felt hungry. Not for food or flesh, but for pieces of him, as though the rot that spread across his skin was only the surface of what the swamp wanted back. He confessed that when he walked near the water, he didn't feel scared the way most children would. Instead, he felt a strange sense of comfort, like he was returning to a place he belonged. His mother's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay steady. She asked him how long he had been feeling this way, and his answer made her blood run cold. He said it started before he had words to describe it. As long as he could remember, the swamp had been whispering to him in sleep, in silence, in moments when the world around him went still. He had just never known how to explain it. The rot, the animals, the missing man, he didn't know if he was responsible, but he admitted something he had never dared say aloud. He said he didn't think he was getting sicker. He thought he was changing, growing into whatever the swamp wanted him to be. The night the rotting trail appeared was the moment the town could no longer pretend the boy's condition was only his own burden to carry. Until then, the rot that clung to him felt contained, something tragic but isolated, something whispered about behind closed doors. But what happened that night made it clear the rot had begun to seep outward, reaching beyond his skin and into the land itself. It started with a cold snap rolling through the valley, the kind that made the swamp steam under the moonlight. A few men returning late from the mill noticed a strange scent on the breeze, heavier and sweeter than usual, like decay drifting from something enormous. They followed the smell into the woods, unsure if it meant a dead animal or another sign they were missing. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest grew. Leaves hummed with a thick stillness, the sort that precedes a storm, yet there was no wind at all. That's when they saw it, a long, winding path cutting through the forest floor, darker than the surrounding mud. It looked wet, soggy, and disturbingly fresh, as though something dripping and heavy had dragged itself through the woods not long before. The trail wasn't straight. It curved in slow, deliberate arcs, weaving between trees and boulders as if whatever made it knew exactly where it wanted to go. One of the men knelt and touched the path with trembling fingers. He jerked his hand back immediately. The mud was cold, freezing cold, despite the humid night air. When he lifted his fingers to the lantern light, a thick residue clung to his skin, dark and sticky like melted bark. But it wasn't sap. It carried the unmistakable smell the entire town had grown familiar with, the scent of the boy's rot. They followed the trail cautiously, each step heavier than the last, dread curling deeper in their chests. The path led them down toward the edge of the swamp, where the fog moved strangely, swirling in patterns too intentional to be natural. As they approached, the trail grew wider, wetter, as if whatever made it had begun to fall apart. Pieces of darkened plant matter and bits of decayed leaves clung to the edges like remnants of something that had dissolved as it traveled. The men shone their lanterns across the water, half expecting to see a wounded animal crawling away. Instead, they found footprints. Small ones, bare ones. A child's footprints pressed into the mud, deep and heavy like each step carried an impossible weight. The prints matched the boy's size perfectly. And worse, they weren't walking away from the swamp, they were walking toward it. The men searched for hours, calling his name, though none of them truly wanted an answer. No boy came out of the fog. No voice called back. The only response was the soft gurgle of the swamp water, rippling as though disturbed by something beneath. By morning, the trail was gone, absorbed into the mud as if it had never existed. Only the memory remained of a path that looked less like it was made by footsteps and more like the land itself was rotting wherever the child had walked. The night the swamp truly awakened, the people of the valley realized that whatever had taken root in the boy was no longer contained within him. It began with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, a subtle thrum that ran through the wooden floors of the cabins near Blackbriar Swamp. At first, the locals assumed it was the wind, or perhaps the distant rumble of an approaching storm, but the sky was clear and the air unnervingly still. The sound grew, pulsing in time with the boy's heartbeat, and soon the water in the swamp began to churn violently, ripples forming without wind, waves rising where there should have been stillness. Reeds bent unnaturally, creaking under some invisible force, while the trees along the swamp's edge twisted as if writhing in pain, their branches clawing at the sky. The scent of rot thickened, rolling across the land like a living fog, so heavy it clung to the skin and hair of anyone daring enough to venture near. Animals fled from the water's edge, birds taking flight in frantic bursts, leaving an eerie, silent emptiness behind. The boy stood at the swamp's edge, motionless, as if he were the eye of the storm. His skin, already mottled and peeling in places, seemed to darken further, soaking up the shadows that crawled through the night. The locals who dared to watch could see that the rot spreading across his body now seemed to pulse in sync with the swamp itself, each beat like a heartbeat that belonged to something far larger, something old and patient and hungry. He lifted a hand and the water responded. Waves licked the mud, reeds bent to form shapes almost human, and the reflection in the black water rippled into forms that were not his own. Some claimed they saw eyes beneath the surface, watching, waiting, recognizing him as one of their own. The creatures of the swamp turtles, snakes, even fish moved toward him instead of away, circling in patterns that were deliberate and unnervingly intelligent. The boy's lips moved, whispering words no one could hear, yet the air felt charged, heavy with meaning, as if the swamp itself were listening and responding. Lightning struck a dead tree nearby, illuminating the scene in a jagged flash. For a heartbeat, the townspeople glimpsed something impossible. The boy was no longer entirely human. His form seemed to stretch and blend with the mist rising off the swamp, edges dissolving into shadow as if he were becoming something elemental. The ground beneath him trembled, soft mud collapsing into itself, pulling down leaves, twigs, and moss, leaving bare, wet channels that pulsed like veins. And then came the sound, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the swamp itself was speaking. It rolled over the hills, shaking cabins, rattling doors, sending a chill deep into the bones of anyone listening. By the time the night ended, the swamp had changed. Paths that had been solid were soft and shifting, waters that had been still bubbled with an unnatural life. And at the center of it all stood the boy, watching, waiting, no longer merely a child born of rot, but a vessel, a signal, a bridge between the living and the decay that pulsed beneath the earth. The villagers returned to their homes trembling, knowing in some corner of their minds that the swamp would never be the same again, and that the boy's presence had awakened forces older than the mountains themselves. The night the boy returned to the place where he had first emerged from the swamp, the air was thick with fog, so dense it felt like walking through a liquid. Every sound was muffled except for the soft squelch of mud beneath his bare feet and the occasional drip of water from the twisted branches above. The swamp seemed alive in a way it had never been before. The reeds shifted and bent toward him as though welcoming him home. The water rippled without wind, and the animals which had long since abandoned fear emerged silently to watch. It was as if the land itself recognized that he was no longer merely a boy, but something far greater, something born of rot and silence and the deep, unyielding pulse of the swamp itself. As he stepped deeper into the black water, the mud around his ankles seemed to grasp him, rising slightly as if trying to pull him into its depths, and yet he did not resist. He moved with certainty, guided by instincts older than the mountains, older than the forest, older than any human memory. The air smelled of decay, sweet and heavy, clinging to his skin, yet he breathed easily, unafraid. Pieces of his flesh, the patches of rot that had tormented him for years, seemed to dissolve into the swamp, merging with it as though they had been waiting for this moment all along. The water hissed and bubbled as though the swamp itself exhaled in relief, enveloping him like a mother reclaiming a child she had long ago lost. The trees groaned and bent, their branches brushing the fog in slow, deliberate gestures, creating shadows that danced like ghostly witnesses. The boy's eyes, dull and lifeless when he had first appeared to the world, now shimmered faintly with the reflection of something else. Something that belonged not to humanity but to the marsh, to the slow, patient rot that had always been his companion. As he reached the center of the swamp, the water began to rise, lapping around his knees, then his waist, until the mud beneath him seemed to disappear completely. The fog thickened further, forming shapes that resembled hands, faces, and twisted creatures of the swamp, all moving in unison, all drawn to him as though he were the heart of their existence. The boy stood still, eyes fixed on the black water, and then slowly sank down, the swamp folding around him like a cocoon. For a brief moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind stilled, the animals froze, and even the distant hills became quiet in reverent anticipation. Then the water closed over him entirely, swallowing the last signs of the boy, and the swamp seemed to settle, smoother, darker, more alive than it had ever been. Whatever had been inside him now pulsed beneath the mud, beneath the water, as if the swamp had claimed him not just as a child but as its own. When the villagers approached the swamp the next morning, there was no trace of him, no footprints, no sound, no scent beyond the faint lingering odor of decay that reminded them the swamp had changed forever. Some swore they saw movement beneath the water, a ripple that suggested he was still there in some form, merged with the very essence of the swamp itself, waiting, breathing, patient. The boy had become more than human, more than child, more than flesh. He had become a part of the eternal rot, a sentinel of the black water, a story whispered in fear for generations. And if you want to hear more chilling tales like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.